Imagine stepping onto a train in Louisiana in the year 1892, knowing that every move you make could spark outrage, resistance, and even change the course of American history. A man named Homer Plessy did exactly that. He purchased a first-class ticket and sat down in a car reserved only for white passengers. On the surface, it looked like a simple act, just one man taking his seat on a train. But this moment was anything but ordinary. Plessy was not just a passenger. He was a symbol of resistance, challenging a system built on inequality. His deliberate action that day led to his arrest under Louisiana's Separate Car Act, a law that forced segregation in railway travel. What followed was a trial that would go on to shape the United States for decades. Plessy v. Ferguson. This was not just a case about a seat on a train. It was about something much larger, whether freedom and equality promised in the Constitution would truly apply to all Americans, or whether laws would continue to divide people based on race. Plessy knew what was at stake. His decision to sit in that whites-only car was carefully planned, supported by a group of activists who understood that sometimes the most powerful way to fight injustice is through peaceful, deliberate defiance. They wanted to test the law, to force the courts to confront the unfairness of segregation, and to demand that America live up to its ideals. The arrest of Homer Plessy sparked a legal battle that went far beyond one train ride. When his case reached the U.S. Supreme Court, it became one of the most significant trials in American history. The ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson would define the boundaries of civil rights for more than half a century, giving birth to the infamous phrase separate but equal. On paper, the court claimed segregation was lawful as long as facilities were equal. But in reality, the decision legitimized decades of inequality, pushing black Americans into a second-class status enforced by law. But here's the most powerful part of this story. Although the Supreme Court ruled against him, Plessy's stand was not in vain. His courage planted seeds of resistance that would later inspire generations of activists. From Rosa Parks refusing to give up her bus seat, to the marches of the civil rights movement that finally toppled legal segregation, his story reminds us that one small act of defiance can echo across time, shaping the destiny of an entire nation. Today, as we look back at Homer Plessy as brave choice, we are reminded that history is not made only by presidents, generals, or lawmakers. Sometimes, it is made by ordinary people who refuse to stay silent in the face of injustice. If you find stories like this inspiring, and you believe that history holds lessons we still need today, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with others. Together, we can keep these powerful stories alive and uncover more hidden chapters of history that deserve to be told. In the years leading up to Homer Plessy's arrest in New Orleans, the battle against segregation was already being waged in quiet yet daring acts of defiance by men like Daniel Distins. His name is not as widely remembered, but his role in this unfolding struggle was essential. Daniel, the son of a prominent Creole family in New Orleans, decided to test the constitutionality of Louisiana's segregation laws before Plessy ever set foot in that fateful train car. His plan was simple but courageous. He purchased a first-class ticket on a train headed to Mobile, Alabama, and intentionally sat in a car reserved for white passengers. His quiet refusal to be bound by an unjust law was a powerful statement, a deliberate attempt to confront a system that was already trying to harden itself into permanence. Yet, unlike Plessy's case, Daniel's fight collapsed in court, undermined not by a lack of bravery, but by legal loopholes and judges unwilling to challenge the racial order of the day. When Daniel took his stand, the legal terrain was still uncertain. Segregation laws in Louisiana were relatively new, and the Separate Car Act had only recently been introduced, making his defiance both daring and untested. But in this first attempt, the courts found a way to sidestep the deeper issue. Because his train was leaving Louisiana, crossing into another state, his lawyers argued that the Separate Car Act should not apply. interstate travel, after all, was supposed to fall under federal authority, not state jurisdiction. On paper, it was a clever strategy that might have opened the door to a larger legal victory, yet the judges refused to grant him that chance, dismissing the case on technical grounds without ever addressing the underlying injustice of segregation. It was a ruling that revealed how deeply the judiciary was entangled in preserving the racial hierarchy, how reluctant it was to confront laws that divided citizens based on skin color. The collapse of Daniel Disdune's case could have been disheartening, a moment when the forces of segregation seemed too strong, too entrenched to be broken, but in truth, his failure only laid the groundwork for the movement that would come after. It showed that the courts were not neutral arenas where justice could simply be argued and won with logic and principle. Instead, they were battlegrounds tilted against those who dared to challenge the status quo. For activists, this was a bitter but necessary lesson. If the fight for equality was to succeed, it had to be prepared for hostility, resistance, and even betrayal from the very institutions sworn to uphold justice. Daniel's experience proved that a single act of defiance would not be enough. What was needed was persistence, coordination, and a willingness to endure repeated setbacks. In this way, Daniel's story is inseparably tied to Homer Plessis. Without the knowledge of how easily a case could be dismissed, without the sting of watching legal arguments dissolve under the weight of judicial indifference, the activists who later organized the Citizens Committee might not have been so deliberate in shaping Plessis' test case. They learned from Daniel's defeat. They realized that the issue had to be framed in a way that could not be so easily brushed aside. It had to be a case that forced the courts to confront the fundamental question: could a government that claimed to guarantee equality under the Constitution also enforce laws that mandated separation by race? Daniel had been a pioneer who took the first step onto a dangerous path, and though his efforts were thwarted, they lit the way for others to continue. What makes Daniel Disdune's contribution so compelling is that it underscores the collective nature of this struggle. Too often history remembers only the names attached to landmark cases, but those names rest on the sacrifices and failures of others who walked the road before them. Daniel's quiet bravery is a reminder that the fight against injustice was never the work of one man alone. It was a relay, with each act of defiance passing the torch to the next, each setback teaching new strategies, each defeat feeding the determination of those who refused to give up. Plessis' stand would later capture the nation's attention. But it was Daniel's willingness to challenge the Separate Car Act first that provided the crucial rehearsal, the early test that revealed how formidable the opposition truly was. As the story unfolds, it becomes clear that these early battles were not wasted efforts, even when they ended in loss. Every confrontation with the law exposed its contradictions. Every failed case revealed the lengths to which judges would go to preserve segregation. And every individual who dared to challenge those laws, from Daniel Disdune's to Homer Plessis, showed that courage was contagious. It was not the victories alone that shaped the course of history, but also the defeats that hardened resolve, sharpened strategies, and prepared a community for the long struggle ahead. Daniel's story deserves to be remembered not as a footnote, but as the foundation of a broader fight, one that would reverberate across decades of American history. When the Supreme Court handed down its decision in 1896, the United States crossed a threshold that would shape the lives of generations. The ruling in Plessis v. Ferguson did not simply resolve a legal question. It set in stone an ideology that would dominate the South for decades. By declaring that segregation was permissible under the Constitution so long as the facilities provided were separate but equal, the court cloaked racial exclusion in a veneer of legality and respectability. It was a moment that silenced the voices of those like Homer Plessis and Daniel Disdune's, who had dared to challenge the system, and it gave legitimacy to a social order built on hierarchy and exclusion. Although the court's opinion might have appeared balanced on the surface, promising equality within separation. Everyone knew that the words were an illusion. Separate was never equal, and the judges who signed their names to the decision knew it. They were not blind to the disparities. They were complicit in maintaining them. The South, already entangled in decades of racial tension since the Civil War, embraced the ruling as if it were a divine endorsement of its practices. Segregation spread like wildfire, not only in train cars and public transportation but also in schools, restaurants, theaters, hospitals, and even cemeteries. Every corner of daily life became marked with lines of division, signs that shouted white and colored, reminders that one group belonged while the other was tolerated only under restriction. It was not just about separation, it was about control, about keeping African Americans in a position of social inferiority, even as they sought to carve out a life in freedom. The law had become a tool of oppression, and the very institution meant to protect liberty, the Supreme Court, had sanctioned it. For black families across the South, the decision meant that the fragile hopes of equality promised during Reconstruction had been shattered. Children were forced into overcrowded, underfunded schools where broken desks and outdated textbooks were the norm. Adults who sought medical care found themselves turned away from hospitals that refused to treat them, or relegated to separate wings with fewer resources. Even leisure and worship were touched by the ruling, with theaters restricting seating and churches sometimes divided down racial lines. This was the lived reality of separate but equal, a constant reminder that equality was never the intent, only separation. The doctrine created not just physical barriers, but also psychological ones, teaching generations of children that difference meant division, and that the law was not a shield but a wall. The ruling also emboldened lawmakers across the South to codify discrimination even further. Jim Crow laws flourished in the wake of the decision, their architects confident that any legal challenge would collapse under the weight of precedent. Courts became hostile terrain for anyone daring to resist, as judges cited Plessy, Ferguson to justify almost every imaginable form of segregation. When black citizens protested, they were not just dismissed, they were silenced, sometimes through the law, sometimes through violence. It was as though the court had provided a permission slip for inequality, one that communities across the South carried proudly. The doctrine seeped into the marrow of American life, shaping not just public policy but also private attitudes, teaching white citizens that segregation was not only acceptable but endorsed by the highest authority in the land. The tragedy of the decision lay not only in its immediate effects, but also in the way it distorted the nation's vision of justice. By legitimizing segregation, the Supreme Court undermined faith in the Constitution itself among African Americans. The promise that all men were created equal, that liberty was the birthright of every citizen, rang hollow when the law was weaponized to ensure exclusion. It created a profound dissonance. The ideals of freedom and democracy were celebrated in speeches and textbooks, yet in practice they were denied to millions. This contradiction was not lost on those who lived through it. Writers, ministers, and community leaders spoke out, documenting the daily humiliations and injustices. But their words often fell on deaf ears in a country determined to look away. And yet, even in the face of this legalized oppression, resistance did not vanish. If anything, the ruling forced African Americans to find new ways to fight back, to organize communities, to build institutions that could sustain them. Churches became more than places of worship. They were centers of resistance and hope. Newspapers carried stories that exposed the realities of segregation to a wider audience. Teachers, even in crumbling classrooms, instilled in their students a belief in dignity and a vision of a better future. The ruling was meant to cement a system forever, but it inadvertently planted seeds of defiance. The very cruelty of the doctrine made its injustice unmistakable, and it created a shared resolve that would eventually grow into the civil rights movement of the 20th century. Looking back, It is easy to see the court's decision as a betrayal of American ideals, but at the time, it was embraced as the law of the land. It would take more than half a century, and the relentless efforts of countless individuals, to undo the damage. The doctrine of separate but equal was a mask that hid injustice in plain sight. A legal fiction that endured until it was finally struck down in 1954 with Brown v. Board of Education. But between those years stretched decades of hardship, decades in which families endured humiliation, communities were divided, and generations of children grew up under a system that told them they were less. The Supreme Court's ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson was not just a legal decision, it was a turning point in American history, a moment when the guardians of justice chose to side with inequality, and in doing so, left a scar on the nation's conscience that would take decades to heal. When the Supreme Court delivered its ruling, it did more than settle a single case. It set into motion a sweeping transformation of social and political life across the United States. The decision gave legal authority to state and local segregation laws, marking the start of decades of institutionalized racism that would shape not only the physical spaces where people lived, worked, and studied, but also the very consciousness of generations. It was as though the highest court in the land had stamped its seal of approval on a system that sought to draw permanent lines between citizens, creating two Americas under one flag. This was not merely a legal technicality. It was a cultural permission slip, an official endorsement that hardened prejudices into law and left those who dreamed of equality with a heavier burden than ever before. To understand the depth of this moment, one must picture the South in the late 19th century, still struggling with the aftermath of the Civil War and the promise of Reconstruction. Freed men and women had once dared to believe that a new dawn was possible, that citizenship, rights, and dignity were within reach. Communities were slowly building schools, churches, businesses, and political networks, holding on to the fragile hope that America as principles of liberty might finally extend to them. But this ruling slammed the door shut on that vision. What followed was not just the separation of water fountains or railway cars. It was the deliberate crafting of a society where one group was told it belonged at the top, and the other was relegated to a perpetual second place. Everyday life was reshaped in ways that were both visible and invisible. Courtrooms, buses, theaters, and restaurants began to carry the unmistakable signs of separation, each one a daily reminder that equality was not recognized here. Schools became battlegrounds of opportunity denied, as underfunded facilities left black children with fewer resources, outdated textbooks, and crumbling infrastructure, while their white counterparts were given the tools to imagine futures filled with possibility. Housing laws created invisible walls between neighborhoods, ensuring that families lived apart, often in vastly unequal conditions. These were not isolated incidents, but parts of a carefully constructed web of legal and social barriers that sought to make inequality seem natural, even inevitable. What made this decision so devastating was the way it legitimized discrimination as a matter of public policy. By claiming that separation did not imply inferiority, the ruling crafted a convenient myth that masked the cruelty of its consequences. It told society that it was possible to divide people while still treating them fairly, even though the evidence on the ground showed the opposite at every turn. This false promise of equality would be invoked for decades to justify the status quo, allowing those in power to maintain control while denying responsibility for the disparities that grew deeper year by year. And yet, despite the heavy weight of this decision, resistance did not vanish. Families, teachers, preachers, and activists refused to surrender the dream of a more just society. In the very shadow of laws designed to silence them, people continued to fight for dignity in small but profound ways. They created their own schools and newspapers, built businesses that served their communities, and nurtured leaders who would one day challenge the system head-on. This dual reality of oppression sanctioned from above and resilience forged from below became the defining struggle of the era. As the decades passed, the effects of the rulings spread beyond the South, although the laws were most explicit in southern states. The cultural message of separation and inequality seeped into other parts of the nation. Northern cities practiced subtler but equally damaging forms of exclusion, with housing covenants, discriminatory hiring, and unofficial school zoning ensuring that separation and disadvantage were not confined to one region. The decision's shadow stretched across the nation, reminding everyone that the ideals of equality and freedom were far from universally applied. The ruling also reshaped how future generations would view justice itself. For many, the Supreme Court was supposed to stand as the ultimate guardian of fairness, the body that ensured the Constitution's promises were kept. But this decision revealed a painful truth, that even the highest legal authority could bend to the pressures of politics, prejudice, and fear. It planted seeds of doubt about whether the system itself could be trusted to deliver fairness, a doubt that would echo through future battles for civil rights. The story of this era is not simply one of despair, but of enduring struggle. While the decision legalized segregation, it also ignited a slow-burning determination among those who refused to accept that inequality was destiny. It forced communities to organize, to teach their children resilience, and to pass down stories of both suffering and hope. Out of this crucible would emerge the leaders and movements that, generations later, would take on the legal and moral foundations of segregation and demand a new reckoning with America's promises. Looking back, it is clear that this ruling was not just a moment in legal history, but a turning point in the national story. It drew a line in the sand, forcing the nation to choose between the comfort of entrenched division and the challenge of true equality. For decades, the nation leaned heavily toward division, but in doing so, it also gave rise to the voices, the courage, and the vision that would one day demand change. The decision marked the start of institutionalized racism, but it also marked the beginning of an era where the fight for justice became not just a hope, but a necessity. And in that tension, in that long struggle between exclusion and determination, the shape of modern America was formed. In the America of the 1830s, where entertainment was beginning to shape public opinion in ways that politics alone could not, a white actor named Thomas D. Rice stepped onto stage with a performance that would echo across generations. He painted his face black, exaggerated his mannerisms, and created a caricature he called Jim Crow. To the audiences of his time, it was presented as comedy, something lighthearted and amusing, but beneath the latter lay something far more damaging, a deliberate portrayal of black people as clumsy, foolish, and inherently inferior. What Rice did, perhaps without realizing the full magnitude, was to plant a seed of imagery that audiences would take not as satire but as truth. His character became immensely popular, repeated and imitated by performers across the country, embedding itself into the cultural fabric of the nation. The stage had given birth to a stereotype that would seep beyond the theater and into the everyday thinking of American society. As the years went on, the word Jim Crow began to lose its original identity as just a character in a minstrel act, and instead became shortened for how many white Americans viewed their black neighbors. The image of incompetence, laziness, and comic absurdity was not confined to the stage but translated into justification for social attitudes and, eventually, public policy. When people referred to Jim Crow, they were no longer simply talking about a performance. They were invoking an entire ideology built on the notion that black people were to be relegated to the margins of society. The mockery became a weapon, shaping minds in a way that turned entertainment into a tool of oppression. By laughing at the caricature, audiences were, in effect, reinforcing a system that stripped dignity and humanity from those it targeted. It was this cultural foundation that made it easier. Decades later, for laws enforcing racial separation to gain legitimacy, once stereotypes are planted deep enough, they become invisible scaffolding that supports discriminatory practices. The laughter that Rice's Act once provoked became the echo chamber in which lawmakers could argue for segregation without shame. For they could claim they were simply maintaining a natural order that the culture itself had already taught people to accept. This is how art, even when intended as mere amusement, can mold society's deepest structures. Rice did not craft legislation, but his character gave life to the very ideas that would make such laws conceivable. By the late 19th century, Jim Crow had morphed into a phrase synonymous with an entire system of segregation that touched every corner of daily life, from train cars to schools, from public restrooms to restaurants. Signs marked white and colored dictated where people could go, what services they could use, and even how they could dream about their futures. Each sign was not only a reminder of separation, but also a reminder of the stereotype that had justified it in the first place. Black individuals were expected to stay within boundaries not just of space but of behavior, always under the shadow of the mockery that had first taken root in minstrel theaters. It was a cultural imprisonment, reinforced by law, that endured for generations. Yet to fully understand the cruelty of this transformation, one must recognize how the name of a fictional character became a label of real suffering. A man on a stage once danced and stumbled in exaggerated fashion, and from that act came a narrative powerful enough to dictate where children could learn, where families could live, and how communities could grow. The character of Jim Crow may have been fiction, but the laws and social codes that carried his name were painfully real, stripping opportunities from millions and relegating them to second-class status in their own country. This was not just a matter of policy, it was a matter of identity, where the very humanity of people was measured against a caricature that had been meant to entertain. The endurance of Jim Crow as both a term and a system is a testament to how culture can outlast the moment of its creation. Rice's Act was born in the 1830s, but its influence stretched deep into the 20th century, shaping everything from education to employment, from politics to personal lives. It reveals how stereotypes, once normalized, can live for generations, embedded in laws, institutions, and even subconscious thought. The name became more than a relic of a theater performance. It became shortened for a system of control, one that cloaked itself in normalcy and tradition, but was rooted in mockery and exclusion. The story of Jim Crow is, therefore, not just about a man and his act, but about how society chooses to accept or reject the images presented to it. When Rice painted his face and stumbled about the stage, audiences laughed. But what they carried home was not just amusement. They carried an image that would justify barriers, rationalize inequalities, and silence the humanity of millions. In that, the true legacy of Jim Crow is not the laughter of the 1830s, but the decades of silence, pain, and struggle that followed. The caricature had become a law, and the stage had become the blueprint for segregation. And so, the name of a character meant for ridicule came to define one of the darkest chapters